Hey everybody, welcome back to our series through the book of James. We're finally now in chapter 5, finishing out the book in the next 3 sessions. This really is an amazing book written by the very brother of Jesus, and James has such profound wisdom for us. This passage today, James has a strict, severe warning towards those who are oppressing the righteous. And so let's go ahead and dive in and read the text together. Starting in James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. Okay, well, those are some powerful words for James to be saying. And by way of overview, let's just stop for a minute and consider what's going on. I want to argue that James is actually shifting his attention away from the brothers. And in this paragraph, I think he's actually confronting unbelievers, people who are rejecting Christ and actually oppressing Christians. And he turns to them, as it were, and has a word or two to say to them. Listen to who he's talking to. He says, "Come now, you rich." This whole paragraph, James is addressing the rich. Now, notice, though, it's not a sin to be rich or to have money, but notice the kinds of things as we walk through this text that whoever it is James is addressing, that they're guilty of. They're guilty of a lot of things, but notice this whole paragraph is addressed to these rich. And we know that because of the repetition of the word you and your. It comes up many, many times, and you can see that James is all confronting really the same genre of person. Your fields you kept back, crying out against you. And then last here in verses 5 and 6, you have lived, you have fattened your hearts, you have condemned, he does not resist you. Okay, so do you get the idea? You. James is really confronting the oppressive rich. Notice something else. James starts off by using this phrase, come now. That's not the first time James has used this. In fact, in just a paragraph before, James was addressing those who are bragging about how much money they're going to go and make, and he said, come now, you who say, we're going to go and make a profit. And it's like his way of saying, listen, we need to chat, okay? We've got to talk about this now. And so James is confronting the rich. And he gives, really, in verse 1, kind of a surprising instruction. It's really the only command in this text. And it's a surprising instruction for us. He says this, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. So there you go. That's the command for this text, weep and howl. Other translations say weep and wail. That's even close to wailing is close to the idea of shrieking, actually. Picture probably a funeral here in the Middle East where there's a procession through the streets and people are wailing, shrieking out in grief. That's the instruction, weep and wail, weep and howl. Why? For the miseries that are coming upon you. What a thing to say. I think as we're going to see here, these people that James is addressing are guilty of some pretty serious things, but it's a profound call to repentance and grief. The miseries that are coming upon you, it's like the punishment that's going to come to you is so severe that the proper response is agony and grief. That's what James is saying. It's interesting as we read this, though, because as you read verse 1, you're saying, well, I mean, what's the big deal here? Like, what are these people guilty of? It's not a sin to be rich, is it? It's not a sin to be rich, but James is addressing some very real, serious sins here. Here he gives the command, but then in verse 2 and the first part of verse 3, he gives the consequences. So weep and wail, because here are the consequences coming your way. Look at what he says. He says they're going to lose everything. They're going to lose their riches, their garments, their gold, and their silver. Their riches have rotted, garments are moth-eaten, and their gold and silver have corroded. You know, this reminds me actually of something else that Jesus said. Remember, he said that we shouldn't lay up for ourselves treasure on earth where moth and rust destroy. So you hear in this passage Jesus' brother James saying something very similar, that when you lay up treasure on earth, guess what? Surprise, surprise, they are moth-eaten and rust comes and destroys it. But this is a really serious consequence. I mean, James is basically saying to the rich, you need to weep and howl because you're going to lose everything. You know, when you think about the timeline of your existence, and then you include eternity, you know, for someone who's rejected Christ and is oppressing and persecuting Christians, if they never repent, they do lose everything. And the proper response is to weep and wail at the grief to come. So we find here's the command, weep and wail, and here's the consequences. You're going to lose everything. And then everything after that, really, it's like we find ourselves in a courtroom here from the second part of verse 3 all the way to the end. And basically what we're going to see is you're guilty on 4 counts. You're guilty on 4 counts, and here they are, and James lists them. So let me clean up our text here, and we're going to see, starting in verse 3, count number 1, here's why you're guilty. It's you have laid up treasure in the last days. So count number 1 for your guilt, you've stored up treasure. Now again, what's the problem with storing up treasure? Isn't it wise to save for the future? Well, it is, but the idea here with this phrase, laid up, it's really the idea of hoarding wealth. It's okay to save for the future, but storing up wealth so that you can rely on your own resources instead of relying on God, that's actually a serious crime in God's eyes. And so it's like you're in a courtroom and count 1 of your guilt is you've laid up treasure in the last days. And there's evidence here. Exhibit A of the evidence, you even see the word evidence here, is that all your gold and silver has corroded. And that heap of corroded treasure stands as evidence against you. So that's reason number 1 why James is saying to the oppressive rich that they're guilty. Next, we come to verse 4, and we see here the next reason for why they are guilty. And it's this: they have cheated their employees. Listen to verse 4. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud. So James is confronting people who are wealthy, and part of how they got their wealth is that they didn't pay the people that they hired to work for them. And so they got their wealth by fraud. And so you're also guilty because of this, you rich, who James is confronting. It's like he calls a witness to the stand. It's as if the wages that didn't get paid are called in as a witness. The wages of the laborers who mowed the field are crying out against you. And so you see back here evidence against you in verse 3, and now the wages that you didn't pay. It's like that's evidenced against you. Notice it's not just the wages that are crying out. The wages cry out, but also the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. look out. The Lord, who has a host of angels, an entire army at his beck and call, he's heard their cries. And so that's the second reason why these wicked rich are guilty. James now lists another couple of reasons here for why these are guilty. Verse 5 lays the third reason. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. It is wrong. It is wrong to live your life pursuing pleasure. Now, I think it's important, again, for us to see, is it a sin to own nice things? Well, maybe. Not necessarily, but it may be. When you live your life and you are focused, the reason you're living is so that you can live in luxury and so that you can self-indulge in pleasure. That actually is a sin. And so we actually need to listen in and take heed and take warning from that. James uses a powerful phrase here. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. This is actually why I think James is addressing those who aren't actually believers. He talks about the day of slaughter. I think this refers to the day of the Lord. It's God's coming judgment. And it's kind of like what James is saying to the wicked rich, is that he's like, God's judgment is coming for you, and you're just piling on the guilt. Like you're asking for it. There's another thing James mentions to these who are unbelievers, and so they're storing up treasure, and they're not paying their workers, and they're living their lives for pleasure. The last is pretty serious as well. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. Those are pretty serious crimes. Whoever it is that James is addressing, they're people that have persecuted and, to a degree, actually murdered righteous people. You know, the love of money can drive you to do terrible, wicked things. And so, guilty on 4 counts here. To make matters even worse, the righteous person doesn't resist you. It's not as if the righteous person instigated something and you lashed out in anger and murdered them. It's you actually instigated this and murdered them. Now, this is actually hinting at what James is going to get into next time as he talks about, he addresses the Christian. And he actually 3 times in the last part of the chapter, brothers. The Christian is to be patient because the Lord is coming back. So we'll get into that next time. But for now, just notice the fact that James is really kind of railing against those who have indulged themselves and oppressed the poor. Even just the way he talks about you have, and you have, and you have. You get the sense that James is just railing on the wicked here. Okay, what do we apply to our lives from this passage? Well, a couple things. Number one, I think it is meant to bring comfort to Christians who are being oppressed and who are being persecuted, and maybe they even know someone that's been murdered because of their faith. It's to bring comfort to them and say, you know what, God will bring justice. God doesn't just turn a blind eye towards the sin of the wicked. God will bring justice, and that is to comfort those who are being persecuted. Second, Christians can also fall into the trap of loving money. And so it's wise to plan ahead and save, but as you do, ask yourself, am I trying to rely on my own resources instead of God's resources? That's a good question to ask. It's good to buy gifts and to take your family on family vacation and invest in your family in that way, but as you do, ask yourself and evaluate for yourself, am I living in luxury and self-indulgence? Am I sacrificially giving enough? Those are good questions for us to ask as well. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us in our text this week. We'll see you again next time.